farming. And what would be said is pretty much what's in the program. So I won't mind if you look down at the program while I'm talking. Maybe it will be a good diversion for you. I'm John Piotti. I'm the President and CEO of American Farmland Trust. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I always enjoy the opportunity to talk with people who care about agriculture and the environment. It's also great to be in northern New England. My wife, Susan, is from Vermont. We live in Maine, but we spend a lot of time now everywhere, it seems, often out of a suitcase. And this was an excuse not only to get to northern New England in the fall, but we actually got a little bit more than 24 hours in Maine 2 days ago, which was really a treat for us. I have some slides. Those slides will suggest some of the things that I say. However, I can't help but point out that listening to the first panel, which was wonderful, I've got my juices all flowing. I've been in this space for 30 years. I've spent a lot of that time focusing on farm viability issues, on focusing on issues around the fair price of food, the real cost of food, and spent a lot of time with dairy issues. So some of those things might pop up during the presentation, we'll see. But I'm probably going to take maybe 45 minutes, and that will leave a lot of time for questions and answers, and we hope to engage everyone in that. So with no further ado, let me jump in. Some of you may know of American Farmland Trust because of our iconic bumper sticker, "No farms, no food." I always have them with me, so there's a number of them out there if you want to take one for your car or your refrigerator or whatever. But a lot of people don't understand much about the organization, and there's far more to us than that bumper sticker. For 40 years, we've been working on critical issues that will really determine, in many ways, the future of our society and our planet. And front and center on that is, of course, the climate crisis that threatens all of us. And farming is one of the few hopeful solutions there. Farming done right really can be a way to combat climate change, while at the same time having this incredible co-benefit of giving us incredible, delicious, and necessary food. Today, I could talk about a number of things, but I was asked to talk a lot about regenerative agriculture, which is sort of a hot topic right now. It's something that American Farmland Trust has been part of since pretty much our origins. But before then, I want to put things in context to talk a little bit about the history of AFT, and maybe before that, just about what was happening in our country in the 1970s that led to the founding of AFT. And the 70s was really a period of environmental awakening in this country. It was also, for those of you who are old enough to remember it, the period of the Arab oil embargo and the energy crisis. And those things really came together, and people began to question some of the industrial farming practices that had been occurring over many decades at that point. You heard earlier how the Green Revolution, a lot of industrial agriculture really picked up pretty heavy in the period of the war and post-war. And by the 70s, some of the negative consequences of all of that was pretty clear. And since a lot of what we had seen in the Green Revolution, a lot of the positive results in productivity were being driven principally by fossil fuel, seeing an oil embargo that made people perhaps for the first time question if there was an unlimited supply of fuel also factored into it. Vermont had an important role in these early years. There was one of Tom's former employees, then Congressman, later Senator Jim Jeffords in the 1970s, said, "We don't really have a handle on what's happening with our farmland resources." And the newly created President's Council on Environmental Quality and USDA teamed up to do a national agricultural land study. that ended up being released literally days before Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. But that was going on in the late 1970s. At the same time, there was this growing appreciation of people of the, maybe we weren't really farming the right way. One of those people who felt that was, in some ways, an unusual character in this story, because she was married to one of the richest men in America. Her name is Peggy Rockefeller. Despite her pedigree, she was in many ways a farm girl, right down to being directly involved in the artificial insemination of her own cattle. And Peggy was, at that time, a member of the board of the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy now does a lot of great work in the field of agriculture, but way back when, it did not. Peggy was on the board. She was concerned and passionate about farming, and she was aware of what Jim Jeffords and his staff were doing with this land inventory. She was aware of the emerging tools of land conservation, which were at that time not being broadly brought to bear on issues of farming. And she said, that's where the Nature Conservancy needs to go. We need to get involved in that space. And there was a discussion amongst TNC's board, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. The next step was to shop the idea around to a number of other organizations, both existing environmental organizations and existing farm organizations. And they all said no. And the reason they said no, and it makes sense if you think about it, we were in a period, still are, although it looks different, but the overall framework is still the same. We were in a period where agriculture and the environment were in many ways at odds, right? Farmers were one of the folks who were degrading the environment by and large. The world has changed. We heard a little bit about it in our morning panel, where here in Vermont and elsewhere, of course, farmers and what they do are still contributing in negative ways to our environment, often frequently through water pollution, phosphorus and nitrogen and the like. Also, of course, and we'll talk about this later, farmers are and can even more contribute positively to the environment. But back in the 70s, there was this tension. And an ag organization that had really been pushing back on the environmental progress that had been occurring couldn't now quickly just sort of embrace that and said, oh yeah, we're going to be part of an environmental solution. And likewise, environmental organizations who had in many cases been putting pressure on the agricultural community couldn't easily embrace it. So the bottom line is there was no existing entity out there that was willing to do what the subject of this symposium is, reconciling agriculture and the environment. AFT was created specifically to serve that purpose, with one foot clearly in the agricultural community and one foot clearly in the environmental community. And Peggy couldn't get TNC to take it on, but she stole TNC's president, a man who became iconic in the conservation world, Pat Noonan, went on to become a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and then founded later, after he, well, we were still on AFT's board at that time, but founded the Conservation Fund, that some of you may know. And Peggy also recruited great people from around the country for these early years. In Massachusetts, the only statewide farmland protection program at that time, the APR program in Massachusetts, had been founded by the then Commissioner of Agriculture, Fred Winthrop, recruited him. From the West Coast, recruited a dairy farmer by the name of Ralph Grassi, who had created one of the first agricultural land trusts in the country in Marin County, so-called MALT, Marin Agricultural Land Trust. Brought together this amazing land trust and organization, and AFT was formed. And then stole other people too. The National Ag Land Study that I mentioned, the champion behind that was a Jeffords staffer by the name of Robert Gray. And Robert got pulled into AFT. Norm Berg another icon in the conservation movement. He was President Carter's head of the Soil Conservation Service, now NRCS. He was the chief, as the man who heads that entity is called. When Reagan came into office, he lost his job, came to work for AFT for the next 26 years as a volunteer, full-time, because he was so passionate about this work. So that's a little bit of nuggets of the history, but I want to take you back to the year of our founding, which was 1980. And for those of us who were involved in agriculture or agricultural policy, you have to get our brains back there to recognize how different the world was. So at that point in time, there was no what I would refer to as an agricultural land trust community. There were a few, including here in Vermont, where the Vermont Land Trust was truly a leader. And some of the comments that were made earlier about some of the easement work that was done in the early days of the farmland protection movement was not only always done the best way, is a result of nobody was doing this. And pioneers make mistakes, but they also lay the groundwork for the future. And the Vermont Land Trust has truly been one of the pioneers. But there were literally just a small handful of agricultural land trusts across the nation. There was no recognition of agricultural conservation easements in federal law. There was no charitable deduction for providing a conservation easement as a donation, which there was for other forms of conservation easements. There were no federal funds for farmland protection. What drives a lot of farmland protection now is a combination of federal funds and private dollars, or federal funds and state dollars. There was nothing, no federal funds for that. There was minimal support in federal policy for various farming practices, things that could improve our environment while helping the farmer potentially have healthier soil and be more productive. There were a couple of programs that carried over from the Dust Bowl days, very small form, thanks to Henry Wallace and his team and what they did back in the 1930s. But none of it was really oriented towards environmental goals. It was really more oriented towards supply management. And then what we often think about as the principal place where conservation work gets done on farms, it almost all comes back to funding that's available through the conservation title of the Farm Bill, so-called Title II. And it didn't exist. The conservation title, we think of it now, of course, it must have been there for ages. It didn't exist. The conservation title was put into the 1985 Farm Bill, did not exist before that. So AFT changed a lot of these things, and I don't think this is hyperbole. There are obviously a lot of organizations involved, but more than any other single organization, American Farmland Trust launched the conservation agriculture movement. We pushed for the Farmland Protection Act, which was incorporated into the 1981 Farm Bill. The first conservation title, as I mentioned, was in 1985. It was driven by a coalition, still active today, called the Conservation Coalition, which AFT formed and led. And the fact that Norm Berg, the former chief of the Soil Conservation Service, was working for AFT made all the difference. The principal intellectual underpinning for the conservation title were white papers that Norm and his team wrote at AFT. Programs like EQUIP, Conservation Reserve Program, ultimately FRPP, the Farm and Ranch Protection Program, which is now a part of ASEP, the Agricultural Easement Program. All of these were things that certainly a lot of groups and organizations were part of, but in many cases, American Farmland Trust was the principal driver and the intellectual force behind. So those are some of the things at the federal level, but there were lots of activity out in states and communities as well. So AFT during this point in time took a number of the models that had been first put forward in places like Massachusetts for purchasing development rights, brought those models to other states, and had a direct hand in 27 states creating farmland protection programs. A lot of local programs as well. You often think of this as principally being a state activity, but to give you one example, and it's on my mind because we just had our annual meeting in Lexington, Kentucky. But Lexington, Kentucky and the 3 counties surrounding Lexington, there is a local purchase of development rights program that AFT helped create that has itself protected 31,000 acres of farmland. So this was a real sea change, and it made a huge difference of providing direct funding at the state and federal level that could support farmland protection. And incidentally, you heard farmland conservation today. I often use the word farmland protection. In many states, say Connecticut, you'll hear it called farmland preservation. They're all the same thing. There's no difference there. There's subtleties as to why some prefer one than another. I think the reason AFT prefers protection is that the word conservation in many farmers' minds means conservation practices that occur on the ground, and this is a way to separate that a little bit. But by and large, all the terms are interchangeable, and it's sort of state preference as to how you hear them referred to. At the same time, AFT had a direct hand in helping create or support a number of agricultural land trusts across the country, using models like the Vermont Land Trust, like MALT, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. We helped create the Colorado Cattlemen's Association, the Georgia Agricultural Land Trust, and the one I had the honor of leading in Maine for many years, Maine Farmland Trust. And then the final thing, which was really a huge signature effort of AFT, was the number of current use taxation programs across the country. Probably you folks are familiar with this. It's basically the notion that farmland can qualify to have the owner of that property pay taxes at its current use, its farm value, rather than its potential value as developable land. Right now, we take this for granted. It barely existed. The first program in the country was in Massachusetts in the 1970s, put forward by one of AFT's founders, Fred Winthrop, who Peggy Rockefeller quickly recruited to the team, given his knowledge and passion. Every state in the union now has one form of this, and this results in literally billions of dollars of support for working lands, and it often goes overlooked. So the bottom line is there's been a lot of really big, important changes that have occurred, and we should take stock of that. And I'm very proud. I'm new to AFT. I've only been on board for 3 years. So I can brag about this stuff because I didn't help do any of it. But what a legacy. It's a really impressive legacy, one we clearly need to build upon, because without a doubt, we have a long, long way to go to get agriculture right. But it's always good to take stock on how different things were just 40 years ago. But the real issue of today is, of course, the climate crisis and everything that comes with that. And farming has a pivotal role to play on helping address this. And of course, American Farmland Trust is not alone in any way, shape, or form, and that's good. We need all hands on deck for this effort. But we do have a longer and, to some extent, a deeper track record in this than others. And we also have a broader perspective. And this is a bit of what I want to talk about today. Because when it comes to climate change, where often people are rushing to talk about regenerative agriculture, regenerative practices, which are critically important, but agriculture's solutions lie in more than just the practices. And I want to talk about that. AFT is the only national group that is really organized around this broader, more holistic mission. Nathan alluded to it this morning in his welcome. We are about the land, yes, and farmland protection as a big part of what we have advanced over the years, be it permanent protection through agricultural conservation easements or protection that occurs through smart zoning and agricultural districts and the like. So that's a piece of it, the land itself. But from the beginning, we have been just as interested in the practices that occur on that land. If you save a piece of land, but all the topsoil washes into the Mississippi River, you really haven't achieved your goal, right? So the practices from AFT's early days was important, and certainly having Norm Berg on staff, the nation's guru on conservation practices, didn't hurt. But we've also, from the beginning, recognized that none of this happens at all, but it certainly can't happen well without having the right people on the land. It is those farmers and ranchers themselves who do the stewardship, and that's critical. So I wanted to call your attention to this because, in my mind, as important as farming practices are, when you hear about regenerative farming, critically important, but, and I'm going to make these points somewhat specifically later, it also relates to having enough of the right land on which to follow those practices, and it also depends in a very important way on having the right people on that land who can do the work. So you hear about regenerative ag. That's the hot topic of the day in some ways. You'll hear other terms as well, and to be honest, a year ago, a lot of people who are now saying regenerative ag were talking about restorative ag, maybe they're talking about climate smart ag. The book in 2015 came out on carbon farming, and a lot of people were using that term then. There are nuances and the differences here, but by and large, these are all practices that are simply building soil health. And by building soil health, we principally mean increasing the organic matter, which you'll remember your high school chemistry. That means carbon. You're increasing the organic matter, you're increasing the amount of carbon in your soil. And where's that coming from? Well, it's principally coming from the atmosphere, pulled down through plants into root systems and the marvelous stuff that occurs in the soil underneath. But I point this out because I don't want anyone to sort of get hung up on the definitions and whether climate smart farming is better than regenerative. They're basically all, for intents and purposes, the same thing. And what do we mean by this? It basically means a whole series of practices. There's more than this list, but these are some of the ones that are primarily thought about. So-called no-till or low-till, where you are not turning over the soil as much. You're often planting crops with drills. You heard Jack today talk about the drill that he got some federal money for, rather than using a plow to disturb the soil. You just put that seed right in, and it grows up with the other vegetation still around it. Anything we can do to disturb the soil less is a good thing to help keep that carbon in the soil. Cover crops, you heard about that as well. All sorts of things that you can use both to keep the soil covered and also to add additional organic matter into the soil. And if you're lucky, that crop itself can also be part of the farm equation for its ongoing success. Active use of crop rotation, so we're getting the most out of the soil, we're not overusing it. A whole range of strategies. Alley cropping is one of them, where you may have trees and open fields and close proximity to each other, some benefits for doing that. And with livestock, notion of intensive rotational grazing, the notion, which has never left in many parts of this world, of grazing cattle in the woods, silvopasture, and things of that sort. So these are the kind of practices that we're talking about here. And why are they important? Well, we had a sea change just about a year ago. This is not new stuff. People have been working on these practices for many years. In AFT's case, for over 35 years. But just about a year ago, a report was issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN that basically said the following: we will never reach the goals of the Paris Climate Accords simply by reducing emissions, as important as those are. We also have to take atmospheric carbon and put it back into the soil through so-called natural solutions. And if you don't believe that this was a sea change, I will give you a very compelling example of it. A little over a year ago, Jerry Brown had a big climate action summit in San Francisco. The Secretary of Food and Ag in California, a woman by the name of Karen Ross, very capable, very talented woman, really wanted to get agriculture front and center in that conversation. Who would be better to do that? Has the governor's ear. She's a force of nature herself. She was formerly the chief of staff of USDA's Secretary to Ag, knew all the players nationally. She pushed and pushed and pushed. The best she could do was to get an add-on day on the front end where some of us spoke about these issues of climate and ag. She could never get it worked in to the big international conference with 4,000 people there. The only mention of ag in that was the usual stuff about how farms contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and how livestock are the end of the world. Which we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. Interesting subject. They're not, by the way. But even she couldn't make that happen. That was a month before this report came out. Ever since then, I can't go to any place, anywhere, without having people ask me, tell me about regenerative agriculture. And they see such hope and promise in it. And so this truly was a sea change. And of course, it was wonderful to have occur. But I want to, let me go back for a second. But I want to mention that as promising as this notion of regenerative agriculture is, and it is promising, I mean, it's a wonderful thing. Think about it. Farming can simultaneously do two things for us. It can grow nutritious food on which we love and depend, and at the same time, it can provide a whole series of wonderful environmental benefits. Wow. I mean, that's really cool. That's great, right? But there are nuances in there. And when we think about the power of what agriculture can do, it's important for us to remember some of these nuances and some of the interconnections. So here's one that I want to point out. And this gets to the issue of how farming practices are directly related to farmland. Remember earlier I talked about we take this holistic view, and these two things are directly interconnected in ways a lot of people don't think about. With every acre of farmland that we lose, we not only lose the ability of that land to provide environmental benefits. I think a lot of people get that. If you lose the land, you can't practice agriculture on it in a way that could provide a whole range of environmental benefits. And in fact, American Farmland Trust about 4 years ago did a study with UC Davis where we talked about just the direct greenhouse gas reductions that would occur by keeping farmland as farmland rather than it go to housing. The numbers were staggering, and we used that to advance state policy in California for the first time ever. They've had a cap and trade authority in California for many years, and they use it for all sorts of great projects, mostly renewable energy and things like that. Great stuff, but they've never done anything with agriculture. We made the case that farmland protection is another way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That has to date resulted in about $120 million of funding for farmland protection in California. We expect it will be $500 million worth of funding for farmland protection by the time that program plays out in 3 years. Significant. First time those two dots had ever been connected. AFT then took that same information, revised it for New York, made the case in New York, and that was a big part of the reason why Governor Cuomo's big comprehensive climate bill that was passed this past spring has agriculture front and center. But I think that part people kind of get, that if you lose the farmland, you lose the opportunity to use that land to have environmental benefit. The next piece, however, is a little bit more subtle. With every acre of farmland we lose, we also put more pressure on the remaining land to be farmed more intensely. Why is that? Because we still need the food, right? Forget about the fact that the need for food, the demand for food could be increasing. Just think about it as a static thing. If there's less farmland available and we still need the same amount of food, we are going to have to use that land more intensely for farm production. Now, I said earlier, farming is an amazing thing because we can use the land to simultaneously do these two great things, grow our food and provide environmental services. That's true, but you can't maximize both. You can optimize it, but you can't maximize it. If you are getting every calorie out of that land, it is coming at some environmental cost. So what this means is that issues of farmland loss are really as important as issues of getting farmers to practice regenerative ag. So I want to go back to the great work the Vermont Land Trust is doing and other efforts that are protecting farmland, because this is critically important. And incidentally, you can do all this amazing regenerative work and build your soil health, and if that land in 20 years becomes a housing development, every bit of value through those farming practices has just gone out the door. So it's critically important to think of the system, and the land itself has to go hand in hand with the practices. And sadly, we're losing a lot of farmland. 3 acres every minute, 175,000, is that right? Well, but I'll jump to the year. 1.5 million acres of farmland a year. And in the last 20 years, it's been 31 million acres. That is roughly the size of Iowa. We've lost that much farmland in the previous 20-year period. Now, I say this to people in the land protection business, and we freak out. Oh my God, that's horrible, it's terrible. But a lot of people, a lot of intelligent people, don't get too worried about this. And why don't they get worried? Well, I hear all these things, right? I hear, well, we actually have plenty of land. Oh, if we just didn't eat meat. I mean, think of all the corn and soy that goes into feeding livestock. Or we'd have plenty of land if we just didn't use all that corn for ethanol, right? So that's one argument. I also hear all the time, increasingly, particularly from some of the high-tech players here, that, well, in the future, we're not going to need farmland to grow our food. All of our vegetables are going to be in vertical farms or controlled ag environment. All of our food is going to come from, all of our meat's going to come from labs. That's really exciting. But you hear this, and these guys believe it. And then the third thing is, I talked earlier about the Green Revolution and how productivity in agriculture soared. It came, that increase came obviously at huge costs, huge environmental costs, huge societal loss. Not the place to get into that. But a lot of people feel that there's no reason why that trend line can't continue, or why we can't have a new boost with technology in the future. And I have responses to all of these. We don't have the time to go into it in detail. We can get into it in Q&A if you want. But I do want to talk a little bit about the last one, this issue of increased productivity. Let's see if I can find my notes here. Well, I can't find my notes, so we're just going to wing it. And the notion is this, that yes, there will be some increases in technology. I think precision agriculture is one of the things that's allowing us to pinpoint whether it's water or nutrients that we might be providing much more successfully. We have measurement capabilities that we didn't have even a few years ago that can allow us fairly simply to look at soil health indices and things of that sort and make adjustments, even adjustments on the fly. So there's a lot of ways that technology is going to help. But I feel pretty strongly that they're not going to provide us alone with the amount of food that we need unless we also protect and retain the farmland that we have. And so my take on this is that we can't aggressively pursue regenerative practices, which we must do for environmental health, we can't do that and simultaneously maximize food production, and that we're only going to realize the results that we both want and need from regenerative farming if we have enough farmland. So that's one place where I'm connecting those two dots of the land and the practices. But let me take this is going to be an intellectual exercise, but let me bear with me for a moment. Let's take this notion further. Let's take this notion not of we might lose so much farmland that we won't have all we need. Let me ask the question about whether we have enough farmland today. Now, people hear that and they say, well, of course we do, right? We're growing all this food that we need. We're helping feed the world. There's all this waste of food product. I mean, they go down the, again, ethanol or whatever. But bear with me for a moment. You know, how much farmland would we lose taking out of the farmland we need for food production if, for instance, a lot of conversation this morning about water, part of that are farming practices, part of that is where we are farming. What if there were adequate riparian buffers on every river and stream to the degree that you were physically preventing most of that nitrogen and phosphorus from getting into the water? What if you had adequate crop rotations and cover crops? You heard from Jack today. When he did that, he needs more land to get the same amount of fodder. He needs more land to produce the same amount of food. And that's true up and down regardless of crop type and form of farming. What if we took marginal lands and allowed them to return to native prairie or native woodlands or wetlands, right? And then what if our goal here was that agriculture would be climate neutral? In the US, agriculture accounts for 9 or 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it has the potential to do more. But if it was doing more, it would take more land to do the same if you were also expecting it to grow the same amount of food. And I'd posit that carbon neutral isn't nearly enough, right? Because we know there are all these other sectors of the economy that can never be carbon neutral. So farming really has to become a carbon sink. And if we start to think about all of these things, you can really wonder about the question of whether we even have enough farmland today. Now, I'm just posed this provocative question without an answer. No one has an answer. It kind of amazes me, if you think about it, this is a fundamental question that no one has an answer to. And AFT is probably as close as any because we've been the repository for close to 40 years of the best data on farm land use, and we've been actively involved in the world of farming practices. We are now ourselves beginning to pull that data together. We now have a powerful new tool that allows us to do this. It's our next wave of research, looking individually at states in the United States. But this isn't a global issue, right? Everything I just said, those all have to be put in context of the overall global system, which is even broader. And nobody has any data that can answer that question. So it's a huge deal that AFT hopes to dive into. A few more years, a few more millions of dollars, and we take checks. So always looking for good supporters. Maybe we can get there. But I can tell you this. Oh, and that was my point here. The next logical step for a lot of our research is to figure out how much farmland we need for these two purposes, both to grow our food and to provide our environmental services. But although we have not yet done this research, I feel pretty comfortable saying what some of the results are going to show, and it's this. Long before we run out of the agricultural land that we're going to need to grow our food, we're going to run out of the agricultural land we need for environmental services. And we don't currently think about it that way. all the assessments about land are based on, are we going to have enough to feed ourselves? And people aren't thinking of it this way, but it's not a huge, it's a completely logical way of viewing it, given everything that I just outlined for you. And it's a critical issue going forward. I have just connected the dots between farmland and farming practices. There's many ways that connects to people, but I'm going to point out just one of them, a very important one. 40% of agricultural land is most likely, according to our research, going to change hands in the next 15 years due simply to the age of the farmland operators. Say nothing about how much more land is going to change hands in, say, the Northeast if the dairy crisis continues and the dairy industry collapses. The only way we're going to retain sufficient land to manage using best practices is if we attract a new generation of farmer and rancher, which is why AFT puts a lot of energy and time into next generation farmer issues. And another point on how this is a system, farmland protection, a story the Vermont Land Trust knows very well. Farmland protection and bringing on the next generation go hand in hand, because farmland protection is one of the few tools you can use to bring down the cost of that land to make it affordable for an incoming farmer. So I can go on and on about different ways that this is really a system, but most people don't view it that way. Federal policy has done amazing things. I look again at the conservation title. Since 1985, that is $120 billion that has flowed towards farmers to do the right thing on their land. Has all of it been wisely spent? Of course not. You know, that's not the way the world works. Some of it has gone for projects that were probably misguided. Some of it has probably been wasted through inefficiencies. But nonetheless, I'd hate to think where agriculture would be today if that investment had not been made over the last 34 years. We would not be talking about the promise of regenerative ag right now in the same way, because we wouldn't have that foundation on which we could build the next steps. So that stuff has done a lot of good. So policy, federal policy, has done a lot of good. But we don't yet have the level of policy at the state or federal level to really address this issue of the next generation of farmers. So a couple of takeaways. One, to combat climate change, we need widespread adoption of regenerative practices and enough farmland to practice those practices on, right? And enough of the right farmers and ranchers. Another, I can't help but connecting the dots, so I'll do it one more time here. AFT's theory of change when we first got into this business of advancing environmentally sound farming practices was if we could show that it works and get a few farmers, early adopters, to follow those practices, had a couple of case studies where we could document the numbers, had peer-to-peer farmers talking to other farmers about what works, everyone would begin to follow the same pattern, right? Why wouldn't they? Particularly when we can often show that better farming practices not only improve soil health, but include productivity. I mean, think about it. When you're improving soil health, you're doing a number of things simultaneously. You're allowing your soil to hold water better, so you can deal with droughts, you can deal with heavy rain events better, both of those. You're often increasing productivity, which, depending on the nature of the farm and the farming business, could lead to greater profitability, right? So this is potentially a double or a triple bottom line for the farmer to follow these practices. If we could show them it's cost effective to do, why wouldn't other farmers naturally embrace it? That was our theory of change 30 some odd years ago. In other organizations that have gotten into this space more recently, Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, and the like, and they do good work, but they're basically following that same theory of change. Just get enough farmers and folks to see the value and to do it. But the truth is, farmers are not switching practices at the level they need to. And there's a whole host of reasons. But when we were hiring, we had to hire for a new research director at AFT. Fortunately, our old research director is not retiring. She's 70, but we're not letting her retire. But the compromise is we bring on a new research director, and they could work jointly for a few years. We get the best of both worlds. And we ended up bringing in this great agronomist. But we seriously wondered if what we really needed was a rural sociologist. Because what we're talking about here is changing of behavior. We know what we need to do on the ground to affect better environmental results. The biggest challenge is getting farmers to do it. And it's not that farmers don't care. I have never met a farmer who doesn't want to do what's right by the land. They care deeply about it. They sometimes, as you heard from this morning's panel, they sometimes have to cut corners because of the economic realities of their particular industry sector. But they all want to do what's right. But even when you can point out you could do this and not lose money, it's hard. Change is hard. Change is particularly hard when you're 60 years old. And when you're a farmer and you're 60 years old, you think you're going to retire in 3 years. You don't. Then you think you're going to retire in 3 more years. You don't. These guys are still farming 15 years later than when they thought they would retire, but that was never in their mindset. So it's been very difficult for them to make, I'm going to just keep what I'm doing. I can't incur the risks. This is a low margin, high risk business. I can't afford to change my operations, and I'm going to retire in a couple of years. Now, the truth is they aren't, and we're still getting the same practices. But to the extent that we can bring on new farmers and ranchers, this is an opportunity. We look at that figure of 40% of the farmland changing hands in the next 15 years, and maybe because of what I just said, it's really more like 20 years. We've been saying 15 years for a long time, and the farmers just keep getting older and holding on. But it's going to happen at some point. And although this is a monumental demographic emergency in some ways, it's also a huge opportunity. Because one way of changing practices is changing operators who come with a different mindset. So that's the first takeaway. We need all 3 of these things, right? More widespread use of the best practices, make sure we keep all of our land, which is the highest and best land for farmland protection, for farming, and make sure we are doing all we can to bring on that next generation of farmers. And the second takeaway is we don't know how much agricultural land we're going to need, but we could be getting close to that tipping point that I alluded to earlier, that point where we may not have enough land to provide the environmental services that we're ultimately going to need. There's a lot of reasons for hope out there. You know, one of the reasons for hope is we have the tools. AFT and a lot of other players, local and state players and national players, have been at this game a long time. We know how to protect land. We've learned a lot in 40 years. We do it very well now. We know what practices are needed. We know the tools for supporting the next generation. We're just not doing any of these things at the level that's needed. We're poised for change in both policy and markets. This came up in the earlier presentation. This could be a long conversation, but ultimately, none of this is going to work until farmers are compensated adequately for both the food that they grow and the environmental services that they are providing. And I do think we are poised for change. Call me an eternal optimist, but I think the next Farm Bill, which will probably be rolling around in 4 or 5 years, could be transformational. And people say, why do you feel that way? It's always been just sort of more of the same. Well, that's not true. It changed abruptly in 1985 with the conservation title. It changed abruptly in 2008 where we linked direct payments and then the insurance program to conservation compliance. There have been significant changes, and I think the big difference coming up in the next Farm Bill is we now have more and more people who care about agriculture and agricultural policy, and we've got climate change, which is going to be front and center in every discussion, and agriculture, as I've pointed out, has a huge role to play there. So I think federal policy is going to potentially play a role, but that's not enough. I mean, everyone looks for the silver bullet. And I have all these folks who think, oh, the answer is in markets. We're going to have a carbon exchange, and that will solve everything. you've probably gotten a sense already. I don't like simple answers. I see the system. And in my mind, we need a combination of public support for farming to make the right things through public policy, the right kind of regulation to force the right things, and on the market side, ideally someday we can get to the issue of some carbon markets and supporting farmers that way. It's a complicated subject, a subject on its own that we probably won't get into today. And we also are seeing within the supply chain major changes right now. The General Mills of the world saying we're going to work with farmers who are following regenerative practices, and that will be rewarded in the marketplace with the ability to have, ideally, theoretically, additional funds to flow back to farmers. Will that be subject to greenwashing and co-opting? Possibly. But I think the market has a role to play in a couple ways, and government has a role to play in a couple of different ways. And then finally, I do think that we are poised to elevate the research in this area significantly. All the pieces are there. And again, call me naive, call me silly, but I honestly think that good research can drive good decision-making and good policy. That indeed is what AFT has been trying to do and done somewhat successfully for the last 39 years. So I'm going to end, before I open it up, with a short video. This doesn't contain anything that you didn't hear about, but it gives me a chance to have some water before I answer questions. So with that. Actually, can you hold it for 1 sec? Yes. Just to give you, I didn't talk about it, but we've always been the entity that sort of holds the, I alluded to this, the land use data for the country, and we basically we work with NRCS, and they look to us as the entity keeps track of farmland loss and those kind of issues. Farms Under Threat is a big national mapping study. We've done them at different periods. Some of you who are of my age or older might remember Farming on the Edge, a big study that came out in the late 1990s. This was sort of the next step in Jim Jeffords' National Ag Land Assessment. And we do it every few years. We released these findings last year. This is the video that went along with it. We'll be releasing phase 2 of this study this winter, which has amazing state and county level detail about what's going on. And phase 3 is linked to a climate model, which is going to be fascinating and will give us the ability to look at different scenarios that could play out over time. But this is a little video we did at the end of phase 1 when we released it last year. Oh. No sound. All right, well, while we're waiting for that, which we may or may not see, any questions? We have mics. No questions? Yes. Here somewhere.
Hi, my name's Andrew Davis. I was a former MAFALP graduate, and I'm now working for the White River Conservation District. And my job is an agriculture outreach specialist, so I go around to different farms and I talk to them about implementing conservation practices on their property. And I hear a lot of feedback from farmers in regards to the reason that they don't take these practices that are known to be financially beneficial to them, and not only that, but environmentally beneficial, is because they say that they lack a lot of the basic infrastructure that allows them the time and the money in order to be able to do these practices. For instance, things like healthcare, childcare, access, other just basic services are lacking in their communities. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the Farmland Trust's sort of position on that, and if they're expanding past and hoping to help those people with those basic services.
Well, it's a great question, and what I really focused on earlier was that it is a system, and sometimes that maybe for a lot of farmers, maybe the greatest thing you could do to help them and free them up so they could think about better farming practices would be, for instance, making sure they had health care in some manner, or child care, or things like that. AFT itself directly doesn't get into that space. We're a small organization, and we have 110 staff people, and it's a big nation out there. And we already have a fairly broad mission, so we're not getting into those issues directly, but we have done a lot of work through demonstration projects helping communities think about the food system and how this fits into it. And so that is an example of where I think state or local organizations can then take the next step. One of the things we do is we train the trainers in issues of land access. When we are doing that, we are passing along tools to local and state groups who can dive in deeper. But I think the point of what you're mentioning is it's all interconnected, right? And it's interconnected in multiple ways. If people are financially strapped, they're in a harder position to implement better conservation practices. People criticize Title I of the Farm Bill all the time, the direct payments portion. It's now an insurance program, but it basically does the same thing. But if farmers weren't receiving some of that support, they couldn't follow some better practices either. So the point is it's all a system, and we have to think about it that way. And we have to be really careful to not villainize farmers who might be operating and, AFT works with farms of all sizes, all types. That doesn't mean that individual staffers at AFT don't feel that certain practices might be better. But our view is all farms can do it better, and all farmers I've ever met want to do it better. Our challenge is providing them with a whole range of tools to help them do that. There's a question over here, I think.
Hi, my name's Lisa McCrory, and I have a small organic diversified farm in not too far from here. And I've also got a background working with farms. I was a resource individual that would go to farms before I decided to be a full-time farmer. And I find that our biggest challenge is there's a lot of farms that just want to get right into it and do the right thing. But in order to access a lot of these funds, they have to have a problem first. So if somebody wants to get in and set up their farm, well, they have to have a certain impact. They have to have a nutrient issue before the funds are available, instead of them having a really beautiful plan to prevent and to actually build Carmet and be a regenerative farm. They have to have an issue first before they can qualify for those funds. And so I would love to see some changes in policy that allow for farms to be proactive instead of reactive, because there's a lot of great new farmers coming down the path right now with a lot of good information and great ideas. But if you wait for them to have an issue first, then that's counterproductive, obviously. And as a very small farm, I like to just play around and see how I can access some of these resources so that we can make improvements on our farm. And oftentimes I go into this knowing that I'm not going to get much, because we're such a small farm that we can't compete with a lot of the monies, because they're going to the Champlain Basin, or they're going to those larger farms that have large issues. But for farms our scale, where we're just needing a little money here and there, we don't get enough points to qualify for the funding that's out there. And by the time the funding is available, like we started working with NRCS and with the Vermont Agency of Ag this spring to implement some things that we wanted to do this growing season, and we didn't get responses about availability of funds until August or September. Yep. It was too late for this season. We've already put our money into it. We're probably going to be able to use some of the funds that were allotted to us, though we only got a small fraction of what we wanted, because we are too small to compete with the larger farms that have bigger issues, maybe. Yep. But anyway.
You raised some good points. You're echoing what I've heard from many people in many parts of the country. I do think it is a place where we need to do more in federal policy and in state policy. And state policy, incidentally, is increasingly playing a big role in this. And again, it's being driven principally by climate. 24 states and Puerto Rico are part of the U.S. Climate Alliance. All those states have made a decision that they're going to meet the Paris Accords on their own. And given what I shared with you, they're cognizant of the fact that the only way they're going to do that is to look at natural solutions, including agricultural practices. I chaired the Agriculture Committee in the Maine State Legislature. I never saw a single bill on soil health. We dealt with everything else. Soil health issues are not things that states have generally been engaged in. That is changing. So I think we will see an increasing number, and AFT is a big part of this. We're one of the impact partners that, with the agricultural lead, sharing information with the 24 Climate Alliance states. But we're going to increasingly see states step up with new programming. We already are seeing some of it, Illinois, New York, a few other examples. Maryland's been doing it for a long time. That's part of the answer. Part of the answer is more on the federal side. You know, what you point out is absolutely true, first off, it's a Byzantine, complicated system to get some of the funding. And we try to remove some of those barriers. We have a program called Women for the Land. Women are terribly underserved by a lot of NRCS programs because they're so complicated, and they don't have the same personal connection with the state con who, I'm oversimplifying, but the male farmer might play basketball with every Saturday. So there's issues of understanding the information, being ready to pounce on it. But the other thing goes back to the slide that I showed before. We know what to do. We are just not doing it at scale. There is limited funds. You know, farmland protection is just one piece of it. The NRCS funding serves about 7 or 8% of the need. And the need would be a lot greater if there was more funding. That need is determined by how many people apply. And a lot more people would apply if they thought their chances of getting funding was higher. So we just need to do more of all of it. Earlier you heard this point about environmental benefit of different things. Weigh these two issues in your head. What you said is absolutely true. The farm with a problem often gets the attention. And that is both a bad thing when it means farmers who might be thinking more progressively ahead of things are not getting attention. But you also want your dollar, your tax dollar, to be responding and providing the biggest bang for the buck. So the answer is we need more, and it needs to be thought through in a more comprehensive way. Another question. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Bob Firevet. I'm with a group called Ethical Leader Vermont. And a couple of points. One, first, some good news that you might not know about is that this past legislative session in Vermont, they implemented environmental services. Oh, you do know about it, okay, where they pay farmers for doing rotational grazing. Mm-hmm. Not a lot, yep, but it's something. Great step forward.
Agreed.
The other point is that I really agree about the need for new farmers, but I think a lot of people, when they hear the term new farmers, they think about young people, mm-hmm, which is great. But I think there's also a great resource of people who are looking for second careers, who want to leave the city and have healthier lifestyles in the country, working on farms. And I think that it's actually, in some places, including here in Vermont, that there's a certain bias against older people going into farming. Almost a problem. So anyway, just want to mention that.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in Maine, at Maine Farmland Trust, I would say 30%, 35% of our land deals, which were brought to bear at the time of closing to make the land more affordable, were helping out those folks 40 to 55 years old, thinking of second careers. A lot of retiring veterans want to get into farming. I couldn't agree with you more. And they often bring skills and knowledge and a diversity that we don't find in just young farmers. We need it all. We absolutely need it all. One last question, then I'm going to show the video, and then I'm going to sit down. So whoever gets that mic.
Hi, my name's Anna, and I'm an apprentice at Kiss the Cow Farm, which is someone who did kind of take a second career path. They've been doing what they've been doing since 2008. And my question is, how are you sharing the AFT mission with a culture, an American culture that's increasingly urban, and especially the youth, the urban population of youth? How are we getting this very rural message that they don't really have an experience with to those kids?
Well, I'm not sure. I'll talk about one thing that American Farmland Trust is doing. I think other groups are doing a lot more in this regard, and we're highly supportive and encouraging of all that. I will say, I got into this space 30 years ago. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I ended up co-chairing the local planning committee in a farm community in Maine, and the farmer challenged me and pushed me to, think about agriculture, and I caught the bug. But the difference between today and 30 years ago is the difference, as an English friend of mine says, between chalk and cheese. There's so much, you may not see it, but there's so much more interest and awareness about where your food comes from, about agricultural issues today than there was. That doesn't mean we're there yet. And I sometimes do feel that almost all of our problems in agriculture would be significantly lessened if just more people understood more about ag. But I do think we're moving in the right direction. Very quickly, with AFT itself, we have formed a formal alliance with Future Farmers of America, FFA, trying to get our research and information in a way that make more sense to high school and college students out there. We've just launched that, and we haven't figured out exactly how it's going to play out, but that's one of the places we're trying to move that needle. And with that, I'm going to show the video, and then I am done.
The United States is blessed with some of the richest farmland and ranch land in the world. This land grows our food, supports our rural communities, and contributes $1 trillion a year to our economy. Well-managed farmland controls floods, suppresses fires, and protects our water and wildlife. And farmland provides a unique tool to combat climate change, a way to sequester carbon through natural means that improve soil health. Our future depends on having enough farmland to both feed us and to restore our planet. Yet our farmland is disappearing. We're losing it to expanding cities and suburbs and to single-family homes built on large lots in rural areas. In 20 years, we've lost 31 million acres, as much farmland as exists in the entire state of Iowa. That's twice the amount previously thought. That's 3 acres a minute, and the loss is irreversible. But there's hope. Since 1980, American Farmland Trust has led a movement of agricultural land trusts and state programs that have together saved 6.5 million acres. Clearly, much more is needed, but the tools are now in place to do more. With your help, we can save the land that sustains us. Learn more about our farms under threat and join the cause.
Thank you again, and don't forget your bumper sticker, or 2.
We're just going to have a quick turnover for our next panel. Starts in like 5 minutes.